Did Aurora really kill Lostbelt Uther? She seems like the obvious culprit, and it's easy to believe considering all the horrible things she did. But while I was working on my recent video on Morgan, I began to question this. So in this video, we are going to look at the evidence we have to say Aurora is the culprit, the evidence against it, and then come to a conclusion. Let's get into it. So first, a quick recap. Morgan, then going by her name of Aesc, Tonaliko? I'm just going to say Morgan. Anyway, Morgan had managed to get all 6 of the Faerie clans to unite under the leadership of Lostbelt Uther. It looked promising that this time, finally, she had managed to settle every little problem that had made her fail again and again at this over the previous 3,600 years. And yet, when the time came, Uther and the Round Table were all poisoned at the coronation, Morgan was blamed, and though she managed to escape, this was the breaking point. She was done with trying to make a better Britain for its inhabitants, and from here on would seek to build her own kingdom to protect Britain, the inhabitants be damned. Let's get into the evidence. It is heavily implied that the one responsible for this poisoning was Aurora, head of the Wing clan, and probably the person who contributed most to the fall of Faerie Britain. She's certainly old enough, having lived for 3,000 years, and so is one of the few fairies that survived the Great Calamity at the end of the Fae era. She would have been 600 when this event happened. Aurora also certainly has the motivation. Her purpose as a fairy is to be the most loved fairy in all of Britain. Those who threaten that possibility, well, they get murdered. All the while, Aurora remains willfully ignorant of her actions. She had the Myr clan killed because their prophecies were drawing attention away from her. She had Noctarib murdered at her coronation, since she seemed like a monarch that might actually be loved, unlike Morgan. Further, when Noctarib is poisoned, Mash compares it to what happened at Londinium 2,400 years in the past, and she would know because she was there. So when it comes to the murder of Lostbelt Uther, Aurora was alive when it happened, had the motivation because Uther was widely regarded, and the way she had Noctarib killed was, according to our witness, just like what happened to Lostbelt Uther. We may not have actually seen the death of Lostbelt Uther directly, or gotten behind-the-scenes moments to tell us who really did it, but there is certainly a strong case here saying Aurora is the culprit. And yet, I said that while researching for the Morgan video, I began to question this. Now what is the evidence that Aurora didn't do it? Well, to be perfectly honest, I only have one real thing to mention that might actually make Aurora innocent, and that is the fact that she is still alive. The murder of Lostbelt Uther was a breaking point for Morgan, the moment when she finally snapped after millennia of abuse. Now, we have come to know Morgan's character pretty well, with her mix of good and bad traits. And one thing we know for sure is that Morgan is utterly ruthless, and, once she has determined that someone is an enemy, will do whatever it takes to eliminate them. Her order to torch the Welsh forest to strike at Oberon, wiping out all of her knights who didn't rally to Camelot before the battle, and her brutal assault upon the invading armies prove this. And this isn't just Morgan as a queen. When Morgan, Mash, Totorot, and Ector go to explore the Great Pit, Totorot specifically says that Morgan is utterly ruthless to her enemies, and this was before the events of Londinium. So with knowing how Morgan treats her enemies, I believe that if she had known that Aurora was behind the poisoning of Lostbelt Uther, she would have killed Aurora. We certainly know Morgan is capable of it. If Melusine can take Aurora down with just a stab, a genius sorceress like Morgan who can fling Rongo Miniad into a completely different Lostbelt certainly can. And yet, somehow, Aurora managed to survive not only the Great Calamity at the end of the Fae era, but over 2,000 years of Morgan's rule in Faerie Britain. Morgan clearly doesn't think highly of Aurora. When finding out Aurora's army will be late to the battle at Camelot, her response is that this sort of nonsense was expected, and to not bother opening the gates for Aurora's forces. Is it possible that Morgan never found out that Aurora was responsible for Lostbelt Uther's death? Maybe. But she had 2,400 years to think about it, so I find that hard to believe. If Morgan thought, solid proof or not, that Aurora was behind the murder of Lostbelt Uther, I don't think she would tolerate her survival, much less as the leader of one of the 6 clans. So where does that leave us? Did Aurora really poison Lostbelt Uther? I'm suddenly not sure about that, or at least there are other questions we have to ask that, unfortunately, we don't have answers for. Was Aurora in a position of power back during the Fae era, or was she merely alive? When did she become the leader of the Wing clan? It might be that Lostbelt Uther was murdered by someone else who has long since passed away, but Aurora, having been alive when that happened, would have known how Lostbelt Uther was killed, and so used a similar method in her murder of Noctarib. Perhaps it was some unnamed fairy who either led the Wing or one of the other clans. Or perhaps it could have actually been Oberon, or some past version of him. He is, after all, the personification of Lostbelt Britain's desire to destroy itself. A united Britain under a popular ruler might have been better able to withstand the great calamities, and so he could have decided to poison Lostbelt Uther to keep that from happening. If this is the case, Oberon probably didn't expect that Morgan would one day return and conquer Faerie Britain by force. We know that he had no way of killing Morgan, and so Oberon was forced to wait for someone who could, which is why Morgan was able to fight off the great calamity 1,000 years prior to the present, the war against the Moors King. In other words, if Oberon took out Lostbelt Uther to try to prevent Faerie Britain's unification in the hopes that the upcoming great calamity would wipe everyone out, then he probably wasn't expecting Morgan to reappear and conquer Faerie Britain. Oberon may be a master manipulator, but Morgan was widely believed to have died after the fall of Londinium, apparently executed by the clan leaders as the scapegoat for Lostbelt Uther's murder. Lastly, we also know that while Oberon may not have actually lived as one being throughout all of Faerie Britain's history, we do know that some version of him has appeared before. When Knight Portune is escaping after the destruction of the Welsh forest, he is then consumed by a host of bugs, something we later see in Oberon's transformation into Oberon Vortigern. But Knight Portune's had only just woken up. He was a veteran of past wars who had been on ice for a long time, but who Morgan awoke for the Welsh forest's attack. As he is being consumed by the bugs, he immediately recognizes it as being just like the Moors King, and his last words, though we only get 3 letters, seem like Knight Portune's is going to say Vortigern. So having gone through all of this, I'm now thinking that our most likely culprit may actually be Oberon, not Aurora, or perhaps some unnamed character who did not survive the Fae era. Now, we don't know exactly how long Oberon has been around, but with how he presents himself as the very incarnation of Lostbelt Britain's desire to destroy itself, it makes it sound like he has been a recurring villain for Faerie Britain for a very long time. It does feel weird to make a video that potentially exonerates Aurora of all people. She is a horrible person who I could easily make a whole video on detailing all of her crimes. And yet in this case, she might actually be innocent. But anyway, what do you think? Who do you believe killed Lostbelt Uther? Do you agree with my conclusions? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out my full video on Morgan. Until next time.